So I push this on, right? Okay. Okay, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me online? First off, thank you all for attending the presentation that I'll be giving today with my colleague, Brandon Hicks. Once again, my name is Josiah Marineau. I'm a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And what I'm presenting today with Brandon is, Brandon, do you want to chime in? Sorry.
Oh, hello, everyone.
Brandon will be co-presenting. He recently got his master's in public administration from UNCP. And what we'll be presenting today is our project, Russian Dissidents, the New White Russians. So to give a very brief introduction, I'm sure everyone here is well aware that following the 24 February 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, hundreds of thousands of Russians fled their country into nearby countries, or in particular of Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, and Turkey. Georgia was the second largest recipient of Russian migrants. So the question we're trying to answer today is, what is the political impact of having tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russians entering into Georgia? And what we'll argue is that Russian migrants, of course, this is an ongoing question. We don't know how this story will end, but at least a provisional answer that we're going to offer is Russian migrants kind of find themselves caught between a government that is arguably pro-Russian, but not in a way that is necessarily going to benefit the Russian migrants, and then a Georgian public, and I kept trying to find like the right adjective or the right way to describe it. The one I settled upon is at the very least, it's very lukewarm towards them. Not necessarily outright hostile, but not necessarily as welcoming as some of the migrants might like. To give a sense of where we'll go over the next, I guess, around 18 minutes is, so I'll talk briefly about the methodology and the approach that we're using for this project. I'll give an overview of Russian-Georgian relations, focusing more on recent history. Brandon will kind of situate this wave of migrants by comparing it to several previous waves of migration, primarily during the Soviet era. And then we'll talk about how the Georgian public has responded to the migrants, the establishment of a vibrant Russian civil society here in Georgia, and then how the Georgian government is responding to the situation. So the methodological approach that we're using is qualitative, based on field research and in-depth interviews that I've conducted here in Tbilisi. I conducted 11 last summer, including both Russian migrants and members of Georgian civil society. So that includes professors, journalists, and NGO workers. And then additional interviews that I've recently conducted between May and June, and that I'll continue to conduct during the remainder of my time here in Tbilisi. So we're offering a qualitative analysis, but we also use historical comparison to situate this wave of migrants in terms of previous waves of migrants from the Soviet Union and from Russia. So even though we're qualitative and having a kind of a field research-based approach, I still appreciate a lot of the ongoing survey research. There's been fabulous research by groups like Exodus 22, I think you say it, ZOIS, and Outrush. So I do utilize and will refer to some of their findings when I'm presenting our analysis here. So to give a brief context of Georgian-Russian relations, because this is very much relevant for the situation for Russians here today. So modern Georgian-Russian relations can be dated to 1991, when both countries are independent of the Soviet Union. They start off at a rocky moment in Georgia's history with the outbreak of several ethnic conflicts in two provinces that we'll refer to again in a second. And Russian-Georgian relations hit a low point with the onset of the 2008 August War, which leaves 20% of Georgia's territory occupied by the Russian military, and this is still the case today. Relations rebound with the coming to power of the Georgian Dream in 2012, and Georgian Dream's foreign policy towards Russia is characterized in their own terms as pragmatic. And pragmatic in this sense seems to mean emphasizing economic collaboration while maintaining ties with the West, but not not bargaining away maybe some of Georgia's core interests as it relates to those two breakaway territories. Now, this pragmatic approach has come under significant scrutiny in recent months with the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian war and with the manner in which the Georgian Dream has responded to the outbreak of the Ukrainian war. So it seems like it's still pivoting towards Russia while not trying to completely alienate its Western partners. So, but it's doing things like refusing to join in the sanctions that Western countries would like to see it engage in, recently allowing flights from Russia, even though Western countries have disallowed flights from Russia, and other activities that for some in the West are seen as worrisome. So the Georgian Dream's kind of arguably pro-Russian stance will be important for the situation for migrants here. So the migrants have arrived in several waves. The first wave of migrants arrives in the weeks and months following the onset of the war. Now, getting exact numbers is difficult, but I've read estimates that around 40,000 migrants arrive between late February and May of 2022. Migrants kind of subside for several months, and then the numbers spike again in September with the declaration of the partial mobilization on September 21st. Now, again, getting hard numbers from the Ministry of the Interior is challenging, but the numbers that have been publicly released state that at least 200,000 or more than 200,000 Russians enter Georgia in September alone. Now, what to make of those numbers isn't clear because we don't know how many of those Russians have actually stayed in the country and how many of those have moved on to second countries. But I've seen estimates that are, we think around 100,000 Russians have entered Georgia and continue to reside in Georgia, primarily in the cities of Tbilisi and also to a somewhat lesser extent in Batumi and Kutaisi. So why Georgia? So why is Georgia the second largest recipient of Russian migrants? Well, proximity is clearly one factor. Obviously, Georgia shares a long land border with Russia. This makes it easy for Russians to travel overland through the open borders. Even if they don't travel overland, they can fly to countries that accepted Russian air flights. So they could travel to Turkey or to Armenia and then travel overland from one of those two countries to get to Georgia. The historical ties between Georgia and Russia are another factor that make it an attractive destination. Georgia has historically kind of played this role as a tourism destination. So at least in the popular Russian consciousness about Georgia, they often think of it as a warm, hospitable place with attractive environment, attractive culture. And then the hospitable visa regime. So you can enter Georgia and stay for up to a year, and you don't need a separate work visa in order to work in the country. So the visa regime is very attractive. The other countries, like countries in Europe, for instance, don't have nearly as lenient of a visa regime. I won't go into great detail about why they leave, but just to give some brief kind of summary comments, you can sort of divide why people leave into maybe ideological concerns versus what you might call material concerns. So by ideological concerns, this would be individuals that are in the political opposition or political activists that leave Russia out of some kind of fear of political persecution. These reasons tend to characterize more the first wave of Russian migrants, the first group of around 40,000 that enter into Georgia. The material reasons, this could be, I mean, one basic material factor is young men that are afraid they're going to be mobilized and sent to a war that they don't support. So they aren't necessarily ideological opponents per se. They just don't want to fight in a war that they don't believe in. Those kinds of rationales tend to characterize the second wave a bit more, which tends to be a bit more male, a little bit younger, and again, more concerned about getting mobilized rather than an ideological opposition as such to Russia. The survey research and my own research has suggested that Russians who have fled say that they're very unlikely to return to Russia anytime soon, even if the war were to end tomorrow, or someone, even if Putin were to either retire or to expire, as it were, they are unlikely to return under the current regime. So if Putin is replaced by the next person in line in the current regime, that's not going to be sufficient for a lot of these Russian migrants to want to go back. So they're kind of homeless. They don't know what the future holds. many of these people did not intend to leave their country, but were sort of forced to, or they felt compelled to. And so there's considerable anxiety over the future. They might intend to stay in Georgia, but if they move on to a second country, they still don't have a sense necessarily of where their lives are headed, which would be a very kind of disquieting situation. So that's a little bit about the migrants as they exist today. I'm going to turn the floor over to Brandon Hicks, who can situate this in terms of previous examples of waves of migration.
So when examining previous waves of Russian immigration, the first wave of immigration occurred approximately a century ago after the Russian Civil War. And this wave was primarily composed of military personnel from the White Army and their families, as well as Russian elites that were fleeing out of the fear of being persecuted by the Bolshevik forces. So there was no real shared ideology among the White Russians, aside from their opposition to the Bolshevik regime, as they included far-right nationalists and left-wing socialists. And this reflects how none of the participants in our study mentioned a shared ideology besides their simple opposition to the current political leaders of Russia. And so the military personnel from this movement tended to immigrate to areas that were still close to Russia because they believed that this was merely a temporary retreat and that they would one day return to Russia in the near future. Whereas the elites tended to migrate to areas like France, where they were able to continue living as members of aristocratic society. So for those that were not a part of this upper echelon, they usually faced impoverished conditions and discrimination in their new host societies, which then limited their employment opportunities to jobs that were not prestigious or well paid. And this mirrors some statements made by participants in our study who claimed that they felt that they had been discriminated against while searching for new jobs abroad in other countries as well. And next slide, please. And so the second wave of immigration is more contentious, as some believe it to merely be an extension of the first wave and their descendants that migrated later on, whereas others use this to refer to those that fled during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. And since this wave was the result of an anomalous global conflict, it does not seem accurate to compare it to this current wave of immigration. However, if the war in Ukraine were to escalate into more of a global conflict, then perhaps this perspective could be re-examined at a later point. Next slide, please. And so the third wave of immigration then occurred in the latter half of the 20th century. And this wave was mainly composed of Jewish Soviets and their families that were able to travel due to the Soviet Union's newly formed relations with Israel and Israel's law of return regarding Jewish individuals that were living abroad. And so Israel was the official designation for these immigrants, though many instead chose to migrate to other nations like the United States. And this actually sparked a disagreement between the United States and Israel, which was resolved when the United States changed the regulations so that these immigrants were required to have direct family members already living within the country before their immigration would be approved. And this then marks another distinction with this wave of immigration, in that instead of attempting to deny the immigration, countries were arguing over who should be allowed to take these immigrants. And this difference may be attributed to the fact that many of these immigrants were highly educated professionals that were seeking new employment opportunities abroad in economically prosperous countries. Thank you.
Okay, so how has Georgian society responded to the presence of the Russian migrants? So is it more characterized by hospitality, or is it more characterized by hostility? Well, if you have been reading the kind of the popular press accounts of Russians in Georgia, the media accounts usually focus on things like visa forms at businesses that kind of, require patrons to, declare their opposition to the war, or that they don't support Vladimir Putin. Russian language has been banned in some businesses or some establishments, or just heavily discouraged. And of course, the ever-present graffiti around Tbilisi saying things like "Russians go home." So if one just kind of focuses on those examples, it might suggest that there's like a deep hostility in Georgian society. And there is some survey research that I think CRRC did in December of last year that says a majority of Georgians actually do not approve of the presence of Russians on, or at least the government's policy towards Russian migrants. So there is some reason to kind of think that there is kind of at least some sort of latent hostility, or at least an unwelcomeness with which the Russian migrants have been greeted. But if you talk to Russians and ask them about examples of interpersonal hostility or people being aggressive to them, I've heard relatively few reports of that. It can happen, but in terms of interpersonal relations, the Russians I've spoken with will tell me how hospitable Georgian people have been towards them. So you don't see many examples of outright hostility that you might expect, given those kinds of topical examples of graffiti and visa forms and whatnot. The flip side to that, though, is it's not clear how much the Russian community is actually engaging with the Georgian community. We'll talk about this a bit more in the next slide, but there's a large network of cafes, bars, and public spaces that are frequented primarily by Russians, and they can sort of exist in Tbilisi and live their lives with relatively little contact with Georgians. Now, plenty of Russians have Georgian friends, but I think you can live as a Russian in Tbilisi and only encounter a Georgian through maybe a landlord or a landlady or perhaps a taxi cab driver. So there's relative limited opportunities for interactions that might have, implications for the lack of interpersonal hostility. What have Russians been doing in Georgia? So there's a lot of work that's looked at the economics of the Russian migrants. I won't focus on that here because there's been some excellent work on that. Instead, what I've noticed is the flourishing of what seems to me like a very vibrant Russian civil society. So on the one hand, we have examples of non-governmental organizations that have been set up, like this example of Immigration for Action, many others like Kovcheg, Frame, and so on and so forth, providing different kinds of services. Some of these services directed specifically at Russian migrants, others actually supporting Ukrainian migrants. You can kind of break their services down into two categories. So emergency assistance for people who have just arrived. Maybe they don't know anyone, they don't know where to stay, so they can kind of access these NGOs to provide some basic information and basic resources. And then adaptation assistance. So for Russians who have decided to stay for at least the foreseeable future, these NGOs like Kovcheg can offer foreign language, or I guess Georgian language training, assistance in kind of navigating the job market, and legal assistance and whatnot. The civil society is also kind of exemplified by the large network of Russian establishments. Some of these are just transplants from Russia. So like the coffee shop Shavi was a coffee shop in Moscow, and then it just literally moved to Tbilisi. Others are new and have been created kind of as they go. So just lots of cultural spaces for Russians to interact, to speak Russian with one another, and engage in kind of artistic and social endeavors. Despite this vibrant civil society, it seems that there's also relatively limited political engagement among Russians in Georgia. Some research has suggested it's lower here than in other countries like Armenia. But one of the goals actually of some of these NGOs is to encourage political engagement among the Russian migrants. Political engagement here often refers to anti-war activities. So maybe attending an anti-war rally. There's a hesitancy to engage in local politics for, I think, understandable reasons. But they're trying to galvanize these migrants into some kind of more or less political opposition that could maybe be useful in the future to help change Russia's trajectory. In terms of how the Georgian government has responded, despite the fact that there is popular opinion that suggests the presence of migrants is not popular, there is popular support for changing the visa regime. The government so far has resisted doing that. Now, the question is why? Is it because the government is pro-Russian, or is it because the government is just opportunistic and the Russian migrants are coming to Tbilisi with a lot of money? They are spending money, they're buying properties. This contributes to a significant amount of economic growth in the country. I think Georgia had the highest level of economic growth in 2022. It was about 10%. The flip side to the high levels of economic growth is the high levels of inflation. So the cost of rents I think I've seen figures that they've suggested they've tripled in recent years. The cost of food has also gone up considerably. So if someone's making 800 lari a month and the price of milk has now gone up to 6 lari, that's a significant portion of someone's budget. And that's going to contribute, I would expect, to some of the frustrations if people start connecting the inflation to the presence of Russian migrants. So the government is not at the moment looking to change the visa regime. But even though it's arguably a pro-Russian regime, that doesn't mean that it's pro-Russian in the way that the migrants might appreciate. There's been many accounts of Russian activists either getting barred from entering the country, or for Russians who had been staying here and they're looking to re-up their visas, getting denied entry to the country, even if they maybe have a business or an establishment or their property here in Georgia. So that concern actually has led some Russians to leave Georgia, or at least kind of provide a disincentive for Russians to want to stay in Georgia for the long term. So again, to kind of conclude, what we're arguing is that the Russians are kind of caught between, I don't want to say between a rock and a hard place because that's too cliched, but between a government that is pro-Russian, arguably, but not in a way that's favorable for the Russian migrants, and a Georgian society that's lukewarm at best, if not even maybe latently hostile towards their presence. Comparing this wave of migrants to previous ones, we argue that this is more similar to the wave of migrants that fled Soviet rule in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War. And one question that I think will be interesting to follow up on is how the opposition will utilize this issue of Russian migrants. Will they see the network of NGOs as potential allies to kind of help promote the democratic space here in Georgia? Or will the opposition use things like the inflationary pressures, the opposition to the current visa regime? Will the opposition use this as a wedge issue to use against the government in 2024? That might come at the expense of the Russian migrants. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And now we have Yasemin Tutar, who will present her paper on Unravelling the Epistemic Community, a review on Russian scientists caught up in unprecedented sanctions. Please, Yasemin.
Hello everyone. Greeting from Turkey. I was planning to come to Tbilisi by person. Unfortunately, it didn't come. I was in Batumi last week. The plan changed. That's why now I only join online. I tried to share my presentation, but couldn't find it. I don't find my presentation. Maybe like this.
I think you could share your screen and we could see your presentation.
Try to run. Okay, let's continue without presentation. As I told you, my topic is about sanctions. Sanctions to Russian scientists. As we know, the more than 1 year Russian-Ukraine war has been causing devastation in the world. Although the reality that the war was fought on the field between troops of Russia and Ukraine, the course of war shows that it was actually conducted between Russia and the Western world. As the world evolved from regional to a global scale, it became a battleground for the world's superpowers. While Ukraine receives both political and military support from the West, Russia has faced significant sanctions as part of this process. These global practices achieved a level of impact that affects all countries at the same point, actually. The aim of this research to analyze of the concept of sanctions with regard to the scientific publication, restriction, and blocking process, which is unethical to the understanding today's democratic society. Because of Russia's aggressive and invading methods, global public opinion on the war between Russia and Ukraine has shifted in favor of Ukraine. The deaths of civilian Ukraine prepared the path of the Western public condemn Russia harshly. However, targeting of civilians in numerous recent wars, civil disruptions, rebellions, or military coups have never generated such a broad popular outrage. At this point, the political attitude of the West and role of the epistemic community cause a separate parenthesis to open the Russia-Ukraine war, actually. As an extension of the global attitude taken against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian scientists were banned from publishing in important international journals and participating in European projects. Are these bans the fight against the war or the decision taken with a political attitude? This is my research question. To discuss the question, first of all, is necessary to touch the concept of scientific freedom, which is at the center of process. The Journal of Molecular Structure, published by the Elsevier publishing house, that has not rejected the call from Ukrainian scientists and has reported boycott to the papers from Russia. The journal's editor, Professor Rui Fausto of University of Coimbra, Portugal, reports that the policy was created to target papers by scientists at Russian institutions. The ban does not apply to Russian scientists and other countries, but scientists of any nationality working for Russian institutions. And also Clarivate Publishing Center has stopped evaluating new journals from Russia and Belarus, indexing Web of Science, which is also important in the scientific community, important indexing community. Russia stated that they will develop their own scientometric system for international publishing criteria. Sanctions were imposed not only in the world of science, but also in the field of art, sports, and music. UEFA, FIFA, and an Olympic committee suspended the participation of Russian athletes and teams of competitions. Similarly, the International Basketball Association supported this decision. Also, pressures coming from singing competitions such as Eurovision and the film industry, they banned all Russian participation to this kind of contest. Today, although the liberal understanding of freedom is socially and globally dominant, it is seen that the interest of institutions or dominant powers are above individual freedoms. Liberal democracies on which Western political understanding is based have a weak contradictory points. The prohibitions and restrictions imposed on the media, where information was circulated during the Russian-Ukraine war, also supported this view. It has been seen that epistemic community, most of which is Western origins, has become a political sanctions tool due to interest of the West. Researchers also around the world continue to debate about science sanctions. The sanctions imposed on scientists have led to emergence of different views in the scientific world. Some say it will be better to maintain ties with scientists and encourage opposition, while others believe all ties should be cut. Here I will share with you the view of some scientists on this subject. In general, while scientists acknowledge Russia's aggressive role in the war, not everyone approves the country's scientists being subject to sanctions for the actions of their states. Matthew Daniels, Deputy of Chief Executive Officer of Director of Science and the International Council of Science, believes that Generating and sharing knowledge is a global responsibility, especially in the world plagued by one crisis after another, like COVID-19. There is evidence that sanctions have weakened and deeply affected Russia's scientific system, but live in a world where we have to address global issues, he stated. Meanwhile, South Africa does not impose scientific sanctions on Russia. The Professor Tayyip, Deputy Director General for General International Cooperation and Resources of South Africa, said he also noted that he's also noted that sanctions will be harm developing countries as well as Europe. It will affect everyone's ability to respond to climate change and address the great poverty and inequality that exist. We want to call for the free values, free principles, he stated, as with economic sanctions, science section not only harm Russia, but also resonate with the wider scientific community. Arctic research in particular may suffer as ties with Russia are severed, and this may have a wider repercussions than tackling climate change. Japan has condemned Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yuko Harayama, co-chairman of Japanese Association for the Advancement of Science, believes science should remain open and support dissident academics living under the bloody regimes. In my view, we need to protect and defend science everywhere without distinction or border, he said that. As we see, a lot of professors and commissions in the scientific area, they are not supported the sanctions to Russian scientists. And also Master University, Professor Luke Scott suggested that it will be a strategic step to set policies to Russian scientists and validate the country's scientific system by stealing their best minds. This is also another impact of the sanctions. This is the brain immigration that he's targeting. The professor said it is a matter of individual responsibility in the global science market. Every scientist, whether from China, Russia, or Europe, has to meet the same criteria of excellence and scientific integrity. Despite the enthusiasm for sanctions against Russia among European and NATO countries, most of the world, including all of Central and South America, Africa, and most of Asia, has chosen to remain on the sidelines. It can be argued that the world's leading democracies are united in opposing Russia's war, and that Russia's Ukraine war is a kind of political struggle of democracy against authoritarianism and as a political system. However, if we look at the population figures of the countries that did not vote for Ukraine's resolution condemning Russia at the United Nations, we see that about half of the world's population is not in a favor of condemning and sanctioning Russia. In the nowadays, the declining in importance of state as a prominent actor in international politics has started a debate about the gradual transformation of international politics in the international relations theory. The debate has focused on attention international relations, scholars on transnational relations. The epistemic community also became important actors. They participate in institutionalization of the policies adopted international political arenas, as they constitute social reality by explaining the relationship between causes and effect. My argument here is that the epistemic communities are increasingly shaping the visions of policymakers, and therefore studying epistemic communities can lead to better understanding of the evolution of international political order. Epistemic communities are the main channel through which consensus-based knowledge about causal links is applied to policy making and policy coordination. States can learn through the process of international cooperation mediated by epistemic communities. As a result, collective patterns of behavior reflect the dominant ideas initially applied to understand the governed field of activity. While not intended to judge scientists, it is extremely dangerous to ban Russian institutions. The scientific community has already experienced deep difficulties over the past 2 years. COVID-19 has disrupted scientific research worldwide, with many scientists forced to change their fields, pause their projects, and postpone the process of scientific discovery due to lack of consumables, labor, and inability to get their laboratories. A comprehensive academic boycott poses an unprecedented ethical dilemma. Should editorial boards make decisions to impose sanctions? Science has no geographical barriers and should have no bias. Russian scientists should not be prohibited from publishing their findings because of government decisions. This practice not only harms Russian scientists, but can have a boomerang effect on other scientists and the scientific community as well. Editors, scientists, academics, and educators worldwide should remain impartial to scientific process and rigorously evaluate the work. The lack of unified, hierarchical, and current structure of international law based on a single constitutional basis. The non-uniform development of individual branches of international law and the lack of regulation in the relation between non-state actors of international society led to prevalence and ambiguity of provision on sanction other coercive measures. This is evident the boycott of scientific work of Russian scientists, I guess. At present, resorting to sanctions is largely at the mercy of political consideration and power plays. This is because such sanctions currently operate in a legal vacuum, as there is no international treaty governing them. Sanctions are embedded international relations, but their status in international law is often contested, and they operated in a gray area between collective sanctions, which are clearly considered legal by United Nations, and clearly legal countermeasures taken within a bilateral interstate relationship. After all this explanation, preventing the free publication of scientific research that will affect not only the Russian scientific community, but also the world of science within the framework decisions taken by scientific journals is unacceptable in terms of both international law and human rights. Freedom of research includes the freedom to freely publish the results of research. The boycott decisions taken by scientific journals are not only unsustainable, but will also call into question the scientific quality of these journals. This is my presentation. I would like to discuss about this issue. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. It was a great presentation, very interesting. We can now open Q&A session. I'm sure you will have many questions to our presenters. For our online audience, you can write us your questions and I can read out for you, or you can also raise your hand and ask questions yourself. I suggest to go one by one and you can ask questions and our presenters will answer. So please feel free to ask your questions. Thank you. Yes, David, I think we have a microphone.
It's okay. I guess I can use this. I have questions to both Professor Marineau and Professor Tutar. The presentation about the Russian civil society here in Georgia. What's your feeling on how do you assess how viable and long-term can be the presence and I would say like impact of Russian civil societies organizations that are operating here, how powerful they might become, or it's just a kind of grassroots initiatives that might not even take off that much, given perhaps how divided Russian immigrant community is, similar to previous years. And for Professor Tutar, I had one question. You mentioned that the Russian social scientists should not be banned from publishing in the international outlets. But an important question there is that many of the academic representatives, especially who stayed in Russia, they sort of tried to ride the wave of this patriotism and started publishing papers or taking part into like academic studies or initiatives that basically like look at how to take over the new territories and also kind of are for the continued occupations of these lands and basically kind of follow the government line. So how do we navigate that distinction of these two types of scientists? Should we make a distinction between these two groups? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so the question is there going to be a long-term impact of these Russian civil society organizations, or is it going to sort of be like a grassroots initiative that kind of plays out rather soon? It's interesting. I had an interview last summer where I asked someone, a Russian migrant, about did he feel that there was like a Russian community here in Tbilisi? And his answer at the time was he had his small circle of friends, but he didn't really have a sense of like a Russian community outside of that. My sense is that this year it's different when you have some of these cultural spaces that have been set up. So I do feel like the Russian civil society groups are having an impact on the Russian community and kind of developing, again, kind of a sense of a Russian community rather than like individualized, atomized friends and friend networks. Now, how will that impact translate beyond that into other kinds of spheres? Like I mentioned, potential collaboration with the Georgian opposition. I don't think we know that yet. I think that's there's more like latent possibility than actuality at this point. But I do get the sense that among the Russian community, the CSOs and just more broadly that there is a greater community among the Russian migrants now than there was maybe initially. So that is my sense.
Can you ask my question again, because I couldn't listen?
Sure. My question is that especially those scientists who stayed in Russia, they try and they continue and they follow the kind of official government policy of basically supporting the war. So, and including many kind of among the academic circles. Do you think that the kind of international academic community should make the distinction between the groups who kind of support and do not support the war in Ukraine, or we should allow kind of everyone based on their scientific merit to be published?
Yeah, that's why I present this subject, this title. The science is should be free. All scientists should be free, and they have to be published whatever they want to, which publication, which journal they are able to publish. The banner coming from not in Russia, the banner coming from epistemic community, I guess. It's coming from Elsevier, European Euro, Web of Science. The journals are very top journals in the world, and they don't accept the Russian scientist publication. That's why the banner coming from not the Russian government, or this is not a Russian policy. The banner only for Russian institutions. Who works in the Russian institution doesn't matter, Russian, Indian, Turkish, but they ban the Russian institutions. But my objection is the science should be free, and globally everyone has to be join this action. I am not supporting the ban. That's why I like to be shared with you. What is your opinion?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you both for really interesting presentations. I have a question for Josiah and Brandon specifically. You mentioned that you had spoken with some nonprofits and some people who are pretty active in the Russian community in the opposition. I'm curious if you about the range of reactions to these nonprofits trying to stimulate political activity among the Russian community. And I asked this question sort of with a personal interest in how these more recent emigres are disposed to political opposition, whether you've seen, people actually being reticent to respond to these organizations like Kovchek, trying to increase participation.
So I just wanted to, I have other questions, but for now, I'll just want to follow up on this question because I wanted to ask about the fact that just in Kyrgyzstan recently, the Russian government, and with cooperation of the Kyrgyz government, has been abducting some of these Russians who have been politically active. So there must be some awareness, I would think, especially now, this potential for danger that some of these Russian organizations would face, which adds a whole other level of complexity to that. And if it might be poster interviews, but I wonder if you might have any impressions on if this is something they're worried about.
Maybe they will.
So thank you. Yeah. So the range of reaction to stimulating nonprofit political activity. So the sense that I get from the interviews I've done and other research that I've read, there was a study by I think it was Zois that compared the Russians in Georgia to the Russians in Armenia, and their study suggested that the Russians in Georgia are particularly politically disengaged. And it's not totally clear from my reading of the study as to why. They suggest it might be regime effects, which could be kind of interesting if that was true. But Russians in Armenia are more politically engaged. And again, there's some questions we might have about the study, but it does seem like there's something about the Russian community here that is a little disinterested in politics, at least compared to some other groups. How have people reacted? So again, I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert on this question. I feel like it's something that's unfolding. The sense that I've gotten from my interviews is that, again, Russians are disinterested here, are disinterested definitely in local politics. I think for very understandable reasons. They feel like their situation is precarious, and so kind of delving into like the protests that occur on Shota Rustaveli might be putting their own livelihoods at risk. And so even when more kind of politically prominent or socially prominent Russians attend the protests, in my experience, they're very much at pains to say that they are attending the protests in a personal capacity and not behalf of their organization, because they don't want to put their organization status at risk. So this was the case during the so-called like foreign agent bill that was obviously under debate and considerable attention given to it in March. I know that there were members of the Russian community that attended that, but my understanding is they didn't want to make it seem like their organization itself was in opposition to that particular bill. And I think in the one organization I spoke with, and I don't want to mention it because it's supposed to be an anonymous interview, but they are engaging in a recent project to try to create more of a political sensibility among the Russians here. And part of that has to do with, and there's other research that has written about this that I'm referring to. It's published on the Outrush website, kind of seeing the migrant communities as a potential like democratic future for Russia, or trying to like take advantage to like the horizontal nature of Russian society outside of Russia and saying like, this is a future of what Russia can look like. It doesn't have to be the stereotypical like autocratic society with the big man leader who's gonna save the country from some kind of calamity. But there is a future for Russia that can look different from that history. And so trying to kind of utilize some of these horizontal communities as a way to kind of demonstrate the possibility of this alternate future. Now, and it kind of goes back to the answer I gave to the gentleman a second ago. I think these a little bit are potential in nature rather than actualized yet. Because again, I think these groups are running into the idea that many of these Russians who have left, not all of them are political activists. There's some who were, particularly from the first wave, but many of these who have left are again, especially the second wave, which tends to be more male in their 20s and 30s. These are people who aren't necessarily politically engaged. They just don't want to fight and die in a war that they don't support. So trying to motivate that community, which is not particularly politically inclined, is going to be much more challenging than that first wave. In terms of Kyrgyzstan, that sounds terrible. I haven't heard that specifically mentioned in my interviews. But I'm sure if that's on a Telegram channel, that kind of example would circulate very quickly and certainly would make an impact. What I have heard is the concern about being too visible and then somehow getting denied at the border. Now, there is an interesting debate as to why. So I've asked Russians, so why are people getting denied at the border? Is this because the government's pro-Russian and it's somehow collaborating with the power structures in Russia to figure out like lists of people to deny? The response I've gotten is that it's more random. And the point that there are other people from other nationalities who have also been denied. So in particular, like Central Asians, I know I've seen South Asians get extra scrutiny at passport control. So they want to argue that this is just random. It just happened to be these Russian activists at that moment. And the West picks up on it as kind of feeding into this narrative of the country as pro-Russian, when it's just out for itself. I'm not sure how much of that line of reasoning is, not that it's not meant sincerely, but how much of this is maybe a defense against this possibility that the government might actually have something that might have a reason to kind of seek them out and to deny reentry. So I don't know how much of it is like a defensive mechanism or not, but at least there is a little bit of a debate in the immigrant community about how actively pro-Russian this government is, as opposed to just being greedy and looking to take advantage of sanctions and other kinds of opportunities.
Next question.
I've got a question also involving migrants, but just before that, I've also heard, and some of you probably have heard this story as well, about this was featured by Meduza, right? I read it in the Russian language version, basically corroborating what you're talking about in Kyrgyzstan in terms of the government using facial recognition technology in order to identify people who are wanted by the Russian Federation, and then these people are detained. Now, Meduza, of course, there's no objective stance in any of this, but I think this is definitely more than a rumor. But in terms of a question for you about migrants, what about looking at the fourth wave of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, right? It sounds like you've thought about this a little bit. This is the wave that began more or less in the 1990s.
Brandon, did you hear that question, Brandon?
Yes, I did. And that was something that we were considering including in this. Partially the reason that we did not include aspects of the fourth wave during the 90s was that a lot of the immigrants during that wave were due to the result, sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union and whatnot, but also that they were more affected by the geopolitics of the region as opposed to making the intentional decision to leave on their own, which is kind of what we included with the focus on the first wave of this conscious decision of having to leave your country even though you regret this, as opposed to the country sort of collapsing and not having a place to go, which is where we went with this current wave of these people don't necessarily want to leave Russia, but they feel that they have to, mostly out of safety reasons of not feeling safe or agreeing with the current political leaders of Russia. But yes, thank you.
Thank you. I also have a question regarding the migration study that you did. It's more of a question of curiosity, I must say, because it's the first time I meet people who actually do research on this topic. It's quite new, right? And I can't help not asking. I had this personal encounter with one of the Russian migrants, and we talked about migration. And he mentioned that he doesn't consider himself as a migrant. So I wanted to ask whether you have come across this idea of these new Russian migrants not considering themselves as migrants. To me, it's unexpected, and also I can't explain the rationale behind this understanding. So, and one more question of understanding: you mentioned something like media covers this and this topics about when it comes to migration, Georgian media, right? So I was wondering whether you have looked at media coverage of these issues yourself, or do you know of any study that looks at this topic? Thank you.
Appreciate the questions. Oh, do we want to do a? Oh, no. Later. Okay. Yeah. So what to call them? No, it's a good question. I will say, because like the term dissident might seem a little provocative in the title, given that I'm also arguing that not everyone is a political activist that has left Russia. I mean dissident in the strict sense that they disagree with the policy. So in this case, they're disagreeing at the very least with the decision to invade Ukraine. So they aren't necessarily all, Alexander Solzhenitsyn individuals, but these are people that they disagree with this particular policy that has a direct bearing on their life. But no, but the point is well taken about what to call them. And other studies, I guess another term is used as relocanti. May not be saying that right, but that's another way of kind of describing it. I would, if I was talking to that Russian, maybe I would say it's also just a descriptive term rather than a normative term. Like if someone has left their country, just by definition, they have migrated. That doesn't mean they're going to stay permanently or stay here permanently or never go back to Russia. But just in the strict sense, it just means that they've left their country. But yeah, but the point about how best to label them is, and who should do the labeling? Is it us academics who get to label them, or should we allow them agency to label themselves and decide how they should be characterized? I think that's a very important consideration. So, but whether migrant is the best term, I think is a good question, especially if it doesn't resonate with their sensibilities. About the media coverage, I haven't seen any systematic studies of the media coverage. I've just read a lot of the Western press, and it tends to be not all, I don't want to say it's all repetitive, but there tends to be very similar themes that come up a lot in the Western media press. And they tend to focus on the things I mentioned about like the graffiti and the visa bans and things like that, which are very real, but I think it also misses, I think just focusing on those examples overstates or at least simplifies the nature of the relationships between the Russian community and the Georgian community. But I think a systematic study would be really interesting to look at how it's been framed in the Western media.
Thanks. I have questions for both presenters, and thank you for your presentations. Regarding sanctions, I sympathetic to this, the ability of individual scientists to publish internationally. My question was more about institutional cooperation. So, for example, when we know that many, pretty much all of the rectors of Russian universities at the very beginning signed a letter in support of the war, does that somehow, or should it somehow influence our decision perhaps to have cooperation between universities, for example, common research teams, goals, Should we be flying to Russia and working with those university laboratories when the university's leadership is specifically in support of the war? And then for this question of migration, I was curious when you talk to Russians, and obviously there's a spectrum. I think I've seen this too, but just in your research, how many of them are really conscious of the colonial aspect of their presence in Georgia, that Russia has long been an occupying power and continues to occupy a certain part of their land? And obviously Georgians they're reminded of it when they see these statements that you talked about. But how much of that resonates, and how much variety did you see in responses among Russians about this question, and maybe the burden that it might put on them? I know that I've seen some Russians who are aware of this and are, for example, participating in environmental organizations, cleanup organizations, to show some kind of attachment to their new country. But it seems to me, when I see Russians just walking on the streets of Tbilisi and they see this graffiti and they know, some of them know, right? Some of them don't care. I just wonder what your interviews told you and how you came out of it.
Thank you. Yasemin, maybe you could answer, and then Josie.
It's better, Marineau, to answer. My point is not. I have no point. It's that question.
All right. So I'm just asking about institutional cooperation. Should we be thinking about limits on the way we cooperate with Russian universities, given that university leadership has signed petitions in support of the war? So this is more than individual cooperation, but it's more on an institutional level, common endeavors, using university facilities in Russia, laboratories. Should these be subject to sanctions in your view, or do you think this is another area where academic freedom should come?
There is no sanctions between institutions. The institutions can sign agreement, continue collaboration, but I guess only European countries has a ban to make some kind of cooperation, because of the European Union programs doesn't allow to cooperate with Russia. After 2020, they banned all the programs to Russian institutions like Horizon and Erasmus, other programs. But individually, in Turkey, we are doing some cooperation with Russian institutions, as well in Ukraine also. We have some cooperation, and I know the other countries has continued to. There is no ban. There is no sanction between institutions. Individually, they can cooperate. As I know, my contacts, I don't know the countries, what are they doing.
Thank you. Josie, please.
Sure. So the question was, to what degree is there a kind of a consciousness of the colonial history between Georgia and Russia? So I do know that is one thing that some of the are trying to make Russians more aware when they arrive, that there is this history, and it's also not just history. Of course, this is very much ongoing. The Russian military is still in those parts of the country. So I know groups are trying to promote that awareness. How broadly that's been disseminated, I think would be an interesting question to look into. Somewhat anecdotally, I know when I've spoken to Russians, they often are aware of it. They might make passing reference to 20% of this country is occupied by our military or the Russian military. So I think at least at a level of basic facts, they at least are aware of that. Now, the emotional resonance of those facts, I'm not sure that has that carries. Like when I talk to a Georgian and they make reference to this, this has a much greater like emotional weight, these facts. These aren't just statistics. These are very much like part of their reality. I'm not sure like the weight of those facts has yet been like maybe disseminated fully among the Russian community. I think of it sort of like in the US perspective where people in the US might know anecdotally about things the US has done wrong around the world, but it maybe doesn't have the same kind of emotional resonance as for maybe those communities that were specifically affected by it. So I think there's somewhat, the way I think of it is kind of there's like a parallel between those two groups.
Thank you. I have one question for you, Josie. As I know, you have conducted in-depth interviews with members of Georgian civil society, right? Were there any contrasting views and perspectives toward Russian dissidents coming to Georgia, and what were these views? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So contrasting views within Georgian civil society. So I've talked to expats who are permanent residents in Georgia, as well as Georgians who, of course, are long-term residents here. And I get the sense that there is a little bit more skepticism about the Russian migrants among the Georgian civil society members than the expat members. There are questions about how much of the Russian community is actually anti-Putin, how much of it is maybe just kind of seeking to avoid a war that they don't want to fight in, but they aren't necessarily unsympathetic to Putin. I do get the sense there's a little bit more skepticism among the Georgian civil society groups. Among the expat civil society groups, I think there's a little bit more sympathy towards the Russian migrants. So I haven't looked as much at that, but I think that again, there's a little bit more scrutiny placed regarding the Russian community by the Georgian specific civil society groups.
If you don't have any more questions, then I would say thank you for our presenters for very interesting and insightful presentations. It was very interesting, really. And now we can take like 20-minute break. And at 16:30, we have a round table on archival access and openness in the Caucasus and Eurasia. Enjoy the break, and thank you once more joining this panel. Thank you.